How I reconciled my brother with his parents whom he hates. They wanted to realize him in what they themselves could not. Family dynamics can be incredibly complex, and growing up I always felt like I was caught in the middle of an unending war. A war between my older brother Jake and our parents. We weren't a wealthy family, but my parents worked tirelessly to provide for us. They saved every penny, made sacrifices, and did their best to give us a decent life. From a young age, I understood how hard they worked, and I respected them for it. But Jake, who was much older than me, saw things differently. The age gap between Jake and me was significant, almost 10 years. By the time I was in elementary school, he was already well into his teenage years, full of the rebellion and frustration that often comes with that age. He always had a chip on his shoulder, always seemed angry at the world, but most of all, he was angry at our parents. I never understood why, and whenever I asked, he would just brush me off or give me vague answers about how they didn't understand him or didn't treat him fairly. I was too young to see what he saw, to feel what he felt. To me, our parents were doing their best, but Jake saw something different. He felt trapped, misunderstood, and stifled in a home where he couldn't be himself. Jake left home as soon as he could, barely saying goodbye. He moved into a small apartment in the city and cut off almost all contact with our parents. It broke their hearts, especially our mother, who couldn't understand why her son wanted nothing to do with the family that had raised him. I was still in high school at the time, and I remember seeing my mother cry in the kitchen, asking herself over and over what she had done wrong. My father would just sit silently at the table, his face set in stone, the disappointment and pain evident in his eyes. I wanted to comfort them, but I was a teenager myself, dealing with my own set of problems. I couldn't understand why Jake was so harsh, why he couldn't see how much they loved him, how hard they had worked for us. It created a chasm between us, one that only grew wider with time. As the years passed, Jake built a life for himself, while I stayed behind, finishing school and eventually going to college. Despite everything, we remained close. He was my big brother, after all. I would visit him on weekends, and he would help me with my homework, take me out to eat, and listen to me rant about my classes and friends. But there was always that underlying tension. He never missed an opportunity to remind me how much he resented our parents. "They never cared about me," he would say, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I was just a burden to them." "That's not true," I would argue, trying to make him see things from a different perspective. "They did everything they could for us. They love us." But Jake would just shake his head, dismissing my words. "You don't get it, and you never will. You're too young. You didn't see what I saw." It hurt to hear him talk that way about the people who had raised us, who had worked so hard to give us a better life. But no matter what I said, Jake's anger remained, festering like an open wound that refused to heal. When it came time for me to go to college, I decided to move in with Jake. It seemed like the most practical option. I couldn't afford to live on campus, and Jake offered to let me stay with him rent-free until I could get on my feet. My parents were supportive, albeit worried about the strain between Jake and them. "Just remember," my mother said as she hugged me goodbye, "we love you, and we're always here for you." I nodded, promising her that I would visit often, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that I would drift away from them the same way Jake had. Living with Jake was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, he was supportive and helpful, giving me advice on navigating adult life and helping me with my studies. On the other hand, his animosity towards our parents was ever present, a dark cloud that hung over our conversations. It didn't take long for tensions to rise. I tried to avoid talking about our parents, but it was impossible. Every time I mentioned them, Jake would get angry, launching into another tirade about how they had ruined his life, how they didn't deserve his respect or love. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Jake turned to me, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're old enough now to understand what they did," he said, his voice low and intense. "You're not a kid anymore. You need to stop defending them and see them for who they really are." I was taken aback. "Jake, they're our parents. They love us. They did their best." "They did their best?" he scoffed. "Their best wasn't good enough. It never was." I felt torn, pulled in two different directions. I loved my brother, but I couldn't understand his hatred for our parents. And I loved our parents, but I couldn't deny that Jake had been deeply hurt by them in ways I didn't fully comprehend. My friends told me to stay out of it, to let Jake and our parents figure things out on their own. But how could I? I was stuck in the middle trying to navigate the rocky waters of our family dynamics without sinking. One day, after another tense conversation with Jake, I decided to visit my parents. I needed some space, some time to clear my head. When I arrived, my mother greeted me with open arms, her face lighting up with a smile. My father, too, seemed genuinely happy to see me. We spent the day together, cooking, talking, and catching up on each other's lives. It was a simple, peaceful day, and for a moment I felt like everything was normal, like our family was whole again. But that evening, as I was getting ready to leave, my mother pulled me aside. "How is your brother?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I hesitated, not wanting to burden her with the truth. "He's okay," I said finally. "He's busy with work." My mother sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wish he would talk to us. I don't understand why he hates us so much." I didn't know what to say. How could I explain Jake's pain to her? How could I make her understand that the anger he held wasn't something that could be easily fixed? As I drove back to Jake's apartment, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I was caught between two worlds, two people I loved deeply, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. When I got home, Jake was waiting for me. "You went to see them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Yes," I admitted. "I needed to see them." He shook his head, his expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. "You're just like them, you know that? You can't let go of the past. You can't see them for who they really are." I felt a surge of anger. "And you can't see that they love you, that they've always loved you." "They don't deserve my love," he shot back. "And you're a fool if you think they do." The argument spiraled out of control, with both of us saying things we didn't mean, words that cut deep and left wounds that wouldn't easily heal. By the time it was over, I was exhausted, emotionally drained. Jake stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. I stood there trembling, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do, how to fix this mess. Days turned into weeks, and Jake and I barely spoke. The tension between us was palpable, a silent wall that neither of us could breach. I felt isolated, torn between my loyalty to my brother and my love for my parents. I didn't know how to reconcile the two, how to find a way forward that didn't involve choosing sides. One evening, as I sat alone in the apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Meet me at the coffee shop down the street," it read. "We need to talk." I hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation forever. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door, my heart heavy with dread. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Jake was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. He looked tired, his eyes dark and hollow. He didn't say anything as I sat down across from him, but I could feel the tension in the air. We sat in silence for a few moments, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice quiet and strained. "I'm sorry." I blinked, surprised by the unexpected apology. "For what?" "For putting you in the middle of this," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I know it's not fair to you. I know you're just trying to do what's right." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I don't want to lose you, Jake, but I don't want to lose them either." "You won't lose me," he said softly. "But I need you to understand that I can't be a part of their lives, not after everything that happened." "I'm trying to understand," I said, my voice trembling, "but it's hard. I love them, and I love you. I don't know how to make this work." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe you don't have to. Maybe it's okay for you to have your own relationship with them, separate from mine." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're saying it's okay for me to be close to them?" "Yes," he said, his voice filled with resignation. "I can't change how I feel, but that doesn't mean you have to feel the same way. You have to live your own life, make your own choices." For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way forward. a way to navigate this complicated web of relationships without tearing everything apart. "I want us to stay close," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want this to come between us." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Me too." As we sat there, sipping our coffee in silence, I realized that while our family would never be perfect, there was still a chance for healing. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward together. As the days turned into weeks, Jake and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we were both committed to making it work. We agreed to set boundaries, to avoid talking about our parents whenever possible, and to focus on our own relationship as siblings. My visits to our parents became more frequent, and I could see the relief in their eyes each time I walked through the door. They were still heartbroken over Jake's estrangement, but they seemed to accept that they couldn't force him to come back into their lives. Instead, they poured their love and attention into me, making sure I knew how much they appreciated my presence. One evening during a family dinner, my mother hesitantly brought up Jake. "Have you talked to your brother recently?" she asked, her voice cautious. I nodded, taking a sip of my water. "Yes, we're working things out." My father, who had been silent throughout the meal, finally spoke up. "We just want him to know that we still love him, no matter what." I felt a pang of sadness for them, but I also knew that pushing Jake would only drive him further away. "I'll let him know," I said gently, "but he needs time." They nodded, accepting my words with a mix of resignation and hope. It was clear that they were willing to give Jake the space he needed, even if it meant waiting for an indefinite amount of time. As I continued to navigate the delicate balance between my relationship with Jake and my relationship with our parents, I found myself growing closer to both sides. I realized that I didn't have to choose between them, that it was possible to love them all in different ways. Jake, for his part, seemed to be making an effort to move forward as well. He started opening up more about his feelings, about the pain he had carried for so long. He talked about the pressure he had felt growing up, the expectations that had weighed him down, and the resentment that had built up over the years. It wasn't easy for him to talk about these things, and there were times when he would get frustrated and shut down. But each time, I reminded him that I was there for him, that I wasn't going anywhere. One day as we were walking through the park, Jake suddenly stopped and turned to me. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious. "About what?" I asked, curious. "About maybe talking to them," he said, his voice hesitant. "Not now, but someday. I don't know if I can ever forgive them, but I don't want to carry this anger with me forever." My heart swelled with hope. "That's a big step, Jake." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not making any promises, but I think it's something I need to do for myself." I smiled, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. It wasn't a resolution, but it was progress. It was a sign that Jake was beginning to heal, that he was willing to at least consider the possibility of reconciliation. As the months passed, our family dynamic continued to evolve. There were ups and downs, moments of tension and moments of peace, but through it all, we remained committed to finding a way forward together. Jake eventually did reach out to our parents, starting with a simple phone call. It was awkward and stilted, with long pauses and strained conversation, but it was a start. Over time, those calls became more frequent, and while they weren't without their challenges, they marked the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story. I continued to visit our parents regularly, and while the pain of the past still lingered, there was a sense of healing in the air. My mother and father seemed more at peace, knowing that there was a chance for reconciliation, however small. As for me, I found that I no longer felt torn between two worlds. Instead, I felt like I had found my place in the middle, a bridge between my brother and our parents. It wasn't an easy role to play, but it was one that I embraced with love and determination. In the end, our family wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But we were learning to accept each other's flaws, to forgive the mistakes of the past, and to move forward with hope and love. And that, I realized, was what being a family was all about. Time has a way of softening even the hardest of hearts. Over the next few years, the tentative peace Jake had established with our parents slowly began to grow into something more. The phone calls turned into occasional visits, and while the relationship was still fragile, there was progress, little steps forward that brought us all closer together. One day, when I was visiting our parents for the weekend, my father suggested something that took me completely by surprise. "How about we invite Jake over for dinner next Sunday?" My mother's eyes widened with both hope and fear. "Do you think he would come?" I hesitated, unsure of how Jake would react. It had taken so much for him to reach out to them in the first place, and I didn't want to push him too far too soon. But I also knew that this could be a chance for healing, a real opportunity for our family to come together. "I'll ask him," I finally said, "but no pressure, okay? If he's not ready, that's fine." My father nodded, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. "Of course. We'll leave it up to him." That evening, I called Jake and nervously broached the subject. "So, Dad was wondering if you might want to come over for dinner next Sunday. No pressure, though. If you're not ready, that's totally fine." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear the gears turning in Jake's head. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know, Lucy. It's just a lot." "I know," I said softly, "and you don't have to decide right now, but I think it could be good. It doesn't have to be anything big, just dinner, just us." Another pause, and then Jake spoke again, his voice laced with uncertainty. "Okay, I'll think about it." The next few days were filled with anxious anticipation. I tried not to get my hopes up, but I couldn't help feeling that this could be a turning point for our family. I didn't expect everything to magically be okay, but I wanted to believe that this dinner could be the first step towards real reconciliation. On the day of the dinner, I arrived at our parents' house early to help with preparations. My mother was a bundle of nerves, flitting around the kitchen as she prepared Jake's favorite dishes. My father was more reserved, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as he set the table. The hours ticked by slowly, and as the time of Jake's arrival drew nearer, I found myself growing more and more anxious. Would he actually come, or would he back out at the last minute? At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. My mother froze, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. My father set down the dish he was holding and exchanged a look with me. "I'll get it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I walked to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, there was Jake, standing on the porch with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he was considering turning around and leaving. But then he looked at me, and I saw the determination in his eyes. He wasn't running away. "Hey," I said, giving him a warm smile. "You made it." "Yeah," he replied, his voice a little shaky. "I'm here." I stepped aside to let him in, and as he entered the house, I could feel the tension in the air. My mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes filling with tears as she took in the sight of her son standing in front of her. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you're here." He gave her a small, tentative smile. "Hi, Mom." There was a moment of hesitation, and then my mother crossed the room and wrapped Jake in a tight hug. For a second, he stiffened, but then he relaxed into the embrace, and I saw the tears begin to well up in his eyes. My father joined them, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder, his expression one of quiet relief. "It's good to see you, son." Jake nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see you too, Dad." The rest of the evening was surprisingly peaceful. The tension that I had feared would hang over the dinner slowly dissipated as we all settled into the familiar rhythms of family life. We talked, we laughed, and while there were still moments of awkwardness, there was also a sense of healing in the air. For the first time in years, I saw my family together, really together. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward, to build something new out of the broken pieces of the past. Jake didn't stay long after dinner, but before he left, he turned to our parents and said something that surprised us all. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," he said quietly. but I'm willing to try." My mother's eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "That's all we ask, Jake. We love you, and we just want to move forward together." As Jake and I walked to the door, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't a perfect ending, and there were still challenges ahead, but I knew that we had taken an important step. When we reached the door, Jake turned to me and gave me a small smile. "Thanks, Lucy, for everything." I smiled back, feeling a surge of warmth in my chest. "Anytime, Jake. We'll get through this, one step at a time." As he walked away, I watched him go, my heart lighter than it had been in years. We weren't there yet, but we were on our way. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future, our future, as a family. The next day, I sat down with Jake for coffee, determined to get to the bottom of his pain. The dinner the night before had gone better than I'd expected, but I knew that if we were ever going to move forward as a family, we needed to address the underlying issues that had caused this rift in the first place. Jake was quiet as he sipped his coffee, his eyes distant. I could tell he was thinking about something heavy, something that had been weighing on him for a long time. "Jake," I began gently, "I know you've been carrying a lot of pain and anger for years, and I've always wanted to understand what really happened between you and our parents. I don't want to pressure you, but I think it would help if we could talk about it." Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hesitation and vulnerability. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I guess I owe you that much," he said finally. "You've been stuck in the middle of this mess for too long, and you deserve to know the truth." I nodded, waiting patiently for him to continue. Jake stared down at his coffee cup, his fingers tracing the rim. "Growing up, I always felt like I was never good enough for them. I was the firstborn, and they had all these expectations for me. I had to be the best at everything, school, sports, you name it. Nothing I did was ever enough. If I got a B on a test, they'd ask why it wasn't an A. If I came in second place in a race, they'd ask why I didn't win." I listened quietly, letting Jake's words sink in. I had never known this side of his story. I had always seen our parents as loving and supportive, but it was clear that Jake's experience had been very different. "I know they wanted the best for me," Jake continued, his voice tinged with bitterness, "but it felt like they only cared about how I made them look to other people. I was just a reflection of their success or failure as parents. If I didn't live up to their expectations, it felt like they saw me as a failure too." "That's a lot of pressure for a kid," I said softly. Jake nodded, his expression pained. "It got worse as I got older. I started to rebel, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't handle the pressure anymore. I didn't want to be their perfect son. I just wanted to be myself, to figure out who I was without all that weight on my shoulders. And they didn't understand that," I said, beginning to see the full picture. "No, they didn't," Jake replied, his voice tightening. "Instead, they tightened the reins. They became more controlling, more demanding. I felt like I was suffocating. The harder I tried to break free, the more they tried to hold on. I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that had been buried deep for so long. It was clear that Jake's anger wasn't just about our parents' expectations. It was about the feeling of being trapped, of not being allowed to be his own person. I resented them for it," Jake admitted, his voice low. "And when I finally moved out, I felt like I could finally breathe. But the anger never really went away. Every time I talked to them, it all came rushing back. The pressure, the expectations, the feeling of never being good enough. That's why I distanced myself. I couldn't handle being around them without all those feelings coming back." I reached across the table and placed my hand on Jake's. "I'm so sorry you went through that, Jake. I had no idea." Jake looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "I know you didn't, and I'm sorry for taking it out on you. You were just a kid, and it wasn't fair of me to drag you into this." "It's okay," I said, squeezing his hand. "I'm just glad you're opening up to me now. I think it's the first step toward healing." Jake nodded, taking a deep breath as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Maybe it is. I'm tired of carrying all this anger around. It's exhausting, and it's not who I want to be." "I'm proud of you, Jake," I said, my voice full of sincerity. "It takes a lot of courage to confront these feelings and talk about them." Jake smiled faintly. Thanks, Lucy. I think I'm ready to start moving forward, to start letting go of the past. I smiled back at him, feeling a surge of hope. And I'll be here with you every step of the way. With Jake's newfound resolve to move forward, the next few months became a journey of healing for our family. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension and old wounds that needed to be addressed, but the lines of communication were finally open, and that made all the difference. Jake began visiting our parents more regularly, and while there were still difficult conversations to be had, there was also a growing sense of understanding between them. Our parents, too, began to reflect on their past actions and acknowledge the pressure they had put on Jake, albeit unintentionally. One evening, Jake and I sat down with our parents for a heartfelt conversation. It was a long time coming, and I could tell that both sides were nervous about what would be said. "I know I've been distant," Jake began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know it's hurt you, but I need you to understand why I had to pull away." Our parents listened intently as Jake opened up about the pressure he had felt growing up, about how their expectations had made him feel like he could never be himself. He explained how it had led to his anger and resentment, and how he had needed space to figure out who he was outside of their influence. There were tears, apologies, and moments of silence as our parents took in everything Jake was saying. It was clear that they hadn't fully realized the impact their actions had on him, and the guilt and sorrow in their eyes were palpable. "We never wanted to make you feel that way," our father said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought we were helping you, pushing you to be the best you could be, but we see now that we went about it the wrong way." "We're so sorry, Jake," our mother added, tears streaming down her face. "We love you so much, and we never wanted to hurt you. We just wanted what was best for you." Jake nodded, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know you did, and I'm not saying this to blame you. I just needed you to understand where I'm coming from. I want us to move forward, but I need you to see me for who I am, not who you want me to be." "We can do that," our father said, reaching across the table to place a hand on Jake's. "We just want you to be happy, and if that means letting go of our expectations, then that's what we'll do." The room was filled with a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off all our shoulders. It wasn't an instant fix, and there were still wounds that needed time to heal, but the willingness to listen, to understand, and to forgive had brought us closer together than we had been in years. Over time, the tension in our family began to dissipate. Jake and our parents started building a new relationship, one based on mutual respect and understanding. They learned to appreciate Jake for who he was, not for who they wanted him to be. And Jake, in turn, began to let go of the anger that had consumed him for so long. Our family was far from perfect, but we were learning to navigate our differences with love and compassion. We were no longer divided by misunderstandings and resentment, but united by a shared commitment to healing and moving forward. And as I watched my brother and my parents finally find common ground, I realized that the love that had always been there, buried beneath the surface, was stronger than any of the pain we had experienced. We were a family, imperfect but whole, and we were finally ready to embrace the future together. As the months passed, our family continued to grow closer. Jake, who had once been so distant and angry, became an integral part of our family once more. We celebrated holidays together, shared meals, and created new memories that slowly began to overshadow the pain of the past. Our parents, too, changed. They became more mindful of their words and actions, taking care to nurture Jake's individuality rather than trying to mold him into something he wasn't. They became more open to hearing his perspective, and in doing so, they found a deeper connection with him than they had ever had before. One day, as we all sat together at the dinner table, Jake looked around at us and smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that I hadn't seen in years. "I'm really glad we did this," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "I didn't think it was possible, but I'm glad we're all here together." Our mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We're glad too, Jake. We love you so much, and we're proud of the person you've become." Our father nodded in agreement. "You've taught us a lot, Jake. We're better parents because of you." Jake's smile widened, and he looked at me with gratitude in his eyes. "And I'm grateful to you, Lucy. You've always been the glue that held us together, even when things were falling apart." I felt a lump form in my throat, touched by his words. I just wanted us to be a family again. "And we are," Jake said firmly, "a real family. One that understands each other, supports each other, and loves each other for who we are." As I looked around the table at my family, my parents, who had grown so much, and my brother, who had found peace within himself, I realized that we had come full circle. The wounds of the past had healed, leaving behind scars that reminded us of where we had been, but also of how far we had come. We weren't perfect, but we were together, and that was all that mattered. In that moment, I knew that the future was bright, and that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them as a family, stronger, closer, and more united than ever before. And as we raised our glasses in a toast to new beginnings, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey we had taken, one that had brought us back to each other, and one that would carry us forward into the future hand in hand. We were a family, and we were finally whole,